What's up, everybody? My name is Grant, and I am a software developer here at Funky Outer Space. Today, I'm just going to talk about the basics of Prisma. And Prisma is an open source tool that we like to use to manage our database. And so, this is just a super basic Prisma file here. It's called a schema. Basically, what this is going to do is inform your database what it needs to look like, as well as all the relationships between tables. So I use an application here called Table Plus, and this is just so I can view my database in an easy way. I can also run queries, things like that. So here on the left, I've basically got two things called models, and each of these models is going to basically correspond to a different table in the database. So we've got user and guitars. So you can see that is reflected right here with our user table and guitars table. The next thing you'll notice is we've got some stuff inside each model. Now, the first row right here is going to correspond to a row in the database, or a column in the database, I should say. So this row, thing on the left here, is the name of the column. So in this case, it's an ID. You can see that right here, ID. And then the next thing over is the data type. Now, this is just basically going to describe what kind of data that column's going to hold, as well as what kind of data that will accept. So for an ID, sometimes you can use strings for these, but for the sake of this example, I'm going to use int, so integer number. And the last thing over here, these are just kind of special things you can do with Prisma. A method here for auto increment. What that's going to do is anytime you get a new row in this user table, it's just going to increment the ID by one. So for example, we've got one item. Actually, we don't have anything in our user table, but let's say we add one item in here. The ID would be number one, and then the next one would be two, three, so on and so forth. This at ID directive also just kind of tells Prisma this is an ID column. And if you do a deeper dive into Prisma, it'll allow you to run queries and things like that and identify rows based on the ID column. And having this ID directive here lets Prisma know, okay, this is to be treated as an ID, not just a normal integer. Okay, so the next column we're going to have is called name. And you can see it right here. And we're going to call this data type string. And string, if you don't know, just means it can be basically any combination of characters, but you got to surround them by quotes or single quotes. And finally, we've got email right here. And again, that's also going to be a string. We do have another directive here called @unique that we're applying to this email. And all that's going to do is basically say, okay, you can't have any two rows in this user table with the same email. So for example, if I had me@gmail.com in one row here, I would not be able to place a second row in this database table with the same email. I could do me1, obviously, and that'd be fine, but it just prevents duplicates. And in the context of an actual web application, that basically means you don't want any two users to have the same email, which is usually their username. So anyway, the next table is very similar. It's just guitars. And you can see I've got an ID, which is the exact same as the user table. It's just going to start with the number one and go up from there. And it's got all the information Prisma needs to know that this is to be treated as an ID column. So the next thing I'll talk about here is a migration. What a migration is basically a list of changes that I make to this file. So for example, if I wanted to add a new column to my guitars table, for example, let's call it strings. And what this is going to represent to me is the number of strings on that guitar. And let's call it an integer because obviously I want this to be a number. And another thing I could do, if this column is not a required field and we want it to allow null values, basically the absence of a value, I can just add a question mark right here. Now you wouldn't be able to do that for something like the ID column, but any other column that I've got here, I can make nullable. You would run into issues trying to make something nullable if we had a relationship between these two tables. I'm not really going to go into that in this video, but for example, if I had maybe a user column on my guitars table that referenced some user from here, that would not be able to be nullable most of the time. And you'll run into different situations. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is make this change and add a new column to my guitars table here. So again, just to recap, we've got ID, we've got, oh, let me actually look at the right table here. We've got ID, we've got brand, and we've got model. So I'm going to add a strings column. It's going to be type int, so it only lets you place a number there. And we're going to run a command to run the migration is what it's called. And basically, when I run this command, it's going to check this schema file and say, okay, I detected that there's something new here. We've got a new column. And assuming I did everything correctly, the command will work and it will change my database to include that new column. So I need to save the file and let's see if I did it right. In my situation here, the command is npx prisma migrate dev. And this can vary from machine to machine. So if it doesn't work, just do some Googling, do some chat GBTing. You can usually find it pretty easily. Okay, so I actually got an error here. So we added the required column strings to the guitars table without a default value. So it's telling me there's already a row in here. It's not possible to do this. There's a couple ways I could handle this. I could, if I didn't care about the information in this database, and for the sake of this demo, I don't, because this is just something on my local machine, I could probably just delete all the data in here and run it, and it would work. But if you're ever in a situation where you're working on an actual website, you never, ever, ever want to lose that data. It's very bad. So another thing I could probably do, I'm going to try making it nullable. And again, adding this little question mark next to this new column is going to tell Prisma, okay, it's okay if there's no value there. And if there isn't a value there, for example, this one row I have seeded doesn't have the strings column, so there's no data for it. This question mark is going to just replace that value with a null, meaning an absence of a value. So I'm going to try that. Save my file. We're going to try it again. Okay, cool. So it looks like we got to the naming step, so that's probably going to work. And each migration, again, migration means a change to your schema here. You should name it something appropriate. So I'm just going to make it obvious. Added strings column to cars model. And let's see if it works. Okay. Now you can see it looks like I've only got one migration going here. If I had more, you would see them listed top to bottom. They'll also be placed in this migrations folder. And you'll see there's a couple in here already. These are just the initial ones I had to make when setting up this repository. But here is the one I just made. And we can see if I expand this a bit, it's got the same name separated by underscores of whatever I entered, so added strings column. Now the next thing I need to do is check my actual database and see if it actually worked. So you'll notice you don't see anything different yet. In this application, I need to hit this refresh button for new changes to show. And looks like we're all good. We actually got this new column here, strings, and you can see that it's got a null value for that first row because I made this row before this column even existed. All right, so now I've got this new column, everything's good. The next thing I want to do is kind of talk about a seed file. Now, a seed file is basically just a simple little file that I've made, and it's going to tell my database, hey, everything in this seed file, put it in this table. And you might do this while you're building things in the beginning just to see if things are working. Or if you had a big list of, let's say, guitars you wanted to exist in this table by default. And then maybe if I actually made like a UI, a user interface for this project, I could have a way for a user to enter new guitars and then enter them in addition to what I have in the seed file. So you'll see right now, this is also what I've already seeded in this file. So let's talk about how that works a bit. Now, depending on if you're using TypeScript or JavaScript, these top kind of statements might vary a little bit, but basically this is what you need. In my case, I've got a JavaScript file, and the directory structure we like to follow is to have it have a seeds folder inside of a source repo. And then inside my seeds folder, I've got one file called guitarseed.js. All right, so the first thing you're just saying, hey, import Prisma, because the seed file is going to need Prisma so that it can interact with my Prisma database and so that I can use syntax with Prisma, like this guy. And then you can see I say await Prisma. Well, what does Prisma mean? I'm defining Prisma right here. So const Prisma is just a new instance of my Prisma client, and my Prisma client is coming from Prisma. So what this does is instantiates an instance of Prisma so that I can then reference it down here when I'm doing database operations. Okay, so I've just got a simple function right here. It's called guitar seed. It is an asynchronous function because when I'm doing something that involves this database, even though it happens very, very fast, it's still not instantaneous. So the async is necessary here so that everything inside of this function can finish, and it will wait for everything to finish. So the next thing I have here is this array called guitars to seed. And right now this is just an array with one object in it. And you'll notice that this data inside this first object matches everything that's in the first row of my guitars table. So what I'm going to demonstrate here is, let's say I want to add some more data here. I'm going to make a new object. Now it's important I make the ID auto increment, just like if it had been automatically created by Prisma. So we're going to go from 1 to 2. And let's give it a brand of Gibson. And let's say I want a Les Paul. Now, because I've got this new column strings, I'm also going to add a strings data point. And if you remember from our schema, strings is an int. So this needs to be a number. So I'm going to say it's 6 strings. Easy enough. Okay, let's save that. All right, so just to recap a little bit, now I've got this array called guitars to seed. It's an array with 2 objects inside. Each of these objects represents one row in this table. And then we're going to go on to the next part of this, which is just a simple loop here. And it's worth noting that this syntax is important when you're using Prisma in my experience. I don't think you can do like a while loop here. I think you have to do a for const of something loop. I know we've run into trouble trying to do other versions of this. So I would recommend always using this syntax. All right, so what we're saying here is for each guitar of guitars to seed. Now you might ask, what's guitar? I don't see what guitar is anywhere. Guitar in this context is just an arbitrary name I'm giving to each thing inside guitars to seed. So guitars to seed has 2 things inside of it. 1 object, 2 object. So when I say for each guitar of guitars to seed, I'm saying for this one and then for this one. So it's a simple loop. And guitar here means the current thing you're iterating through. So the first time this loop runs, guitar.id is going to point to the first thing in guitars to seed .id. So the first time this loop runs, guitar.id is going to equal 1. This ID equals 1. The second time this loop runs, because it's going to go through each thing in this array, ID is going to be equal to 2. So await is something you use with the async functions. It's a keyword. And we're saying Prisma. Again, Prisma is just saying to import Prisma as an instance of our Prisma client. The next part of this phrase is going to be guitars. Now, guitars here represents the table name I'm trying to operate on. And this syntax is pretty much the same for a lot of database queries and operations you're going to use with Prisma. So I could also do something like await prisma.user.upsert. And it's the same syntax. What that means is just instead of targeting the guitar table, prisma.user is now targeting the user table. But in this situation, all I want to do is target my guitars table. So I'm using guitars. Now upsert. If you don't know what upsert means, It's basically a combination of create or update. So let's talk about there's three little clauses in here. The first is a where clause. So it's basically a condition. So it's saying where the ID is equal to the guitar.id. So again, um, since we're upserting, we're also going to update if there's a row that already exists. And so to give you a better example of that, since I already have a row in here called with the ID of 1 right from here, when I run this seed command again, because I'm going to be running this quite a bit if I'm in an actual application, you don't want to have two different rows trying to have the same ID. It won't let you anyway. What this is saying is if there's already a row in this table with the ID of 1, and that is in this where clause, we're going to update. And what we're going to update is the guitar.brand column, and we're going to replace that with whatever brands we have here. The model column is going to be replaced with whatever guitar.model info we have here. So if the first time I ran this seed, I gave a brand, let's say Fender, Telecaster. What if I wanted to change that to Stratocaster? So I'm going to do that. Now, the next time I run this seed file, it's going to know, oh, okay, you've already got a row in here with the ID of 1. But the model used to say Telecaster, now says Stratocaster. So if I find a row with the ID equal to the guitar.id, again, the first iteration of that would be 1. So it does find this row. I'm going to update the brand to be the new guitar brand, which stands for whatever I've most recently added here, model to be the guitar.model. And since we also have this new column called strings, I also need to add strings to guitar.strings. This way, if I didn't do this, it would not update that column. So I need to add that. So that is to handle the situation when you're updating a row. So if I find a row with the ID that it equals my current guitar.id, I go to this part of the clause which says update. Now, if I don't find a matching ID, that's when you do what's in the create object here. So in the situation where I've got this new guitar with an ID of 2, it's not going to find an existing row in my database with the ID of 2. So it's going to go to the create part of this. And that's why I've got it saying ID with guitar.id, but I don't have an ID in the update portion because, again, if I'm in the update portion, I've already located a row with an ID. But if I'm creating something new that doesn't exist yet, obviously, I won't have an ID, so you need to put that. Now, just like I just updated this update, I also need to add our new column, strings. And I actually misspelled the column name. It's strings plural, not singular. So Prisma won't know what I'm talking about if I just tried to do string here, and it would probably break. Wouldn't work. That is the basics of how the seed loop is going to work. Now, this stuff down here is just pretty, as far as I know, pretty much just Prisma syntax. And you'll see that you've got kind of a try-catch structure to this. What this does is guitar seed with the parentheses is, here's guitar seed. It's going to invoke that function. Basically, it's just going to call the function I've defined, guitar seed, which includes my seed data, the data I want to include in my database, as well as the loop to perform the database operations on that data. What this catch is going to do is basically if something goes wrong in the process of this, it's just going to console log whatever went wrong and then stop the process. And then your finally is if everything goes well, everything works, it's going to disconnect. And so, again, as far as I know, this is pretty much stuff you want anytime you're doing something like this. Okay, so I've updated my seed file. If I've did this correctly, what I'm expecting to happen is for my first existing row to have an updated model name because I changed that from Telecaster to Stratocaster. I'm also expecting that I'll have a new row with the ID of 2 that has all this data I've written. So if I can remember the command for npx, I think it's Prisma db seed. npx Prisma db seed. All right, looks like we did something right. So Ran the command, seed has been executed. No red squiggly lines or anything like that, so this looks good. And doesn't look like anything changed yet, but that's probably because I haven't refreshed. All right. As you can see, looks like everything worked correctly. My first item that was pre-existing is now updated to the model name of Stratocaster, and my second item is now Gibson Les Paul. With my strings column is null, so because it doesn't have a value for this first item, and strings value of 6 for this. Hopefully this was pretty helpful for some basics on Prisma as well as how to seed some initial data, and make sure you like and subscribe if you liked it.